A dream can be a powerful thing. I'm not talking about those dreams that you have where you're driving in your front yard or you forget to wear your pants to work or you're being chased by a flying spider. No, I'm talking about a dream as a vision, specifically as a vision of a preferred future. You ever had that kind of dream? If you're alive, if you're breathing, you probably had. Maybe it's a job that you always wanted, a promotion that you dreamed about. Maybe it's for a family, a house, a marriage, kids, a spouse, a particular relationship. Maybe it's for a particular achievement or award or accomplishment or degree or some recognition or some championship for you or for somebody that you care about. A dream can be all-consuming. It can give us motivation to get up in the morning, to propel us forward, give us motivation, give us a purpose, give us a reason for living. A dream can give us happiness, even when we don't yet have it, which is kind of ironic. Pursuing it, imagining it can make us happy, can give us fulfillment. And dreams sell too. They can make a lot of money. There are businesses that are built upon the idea of making your dreams come true. There are theme parks that are built with the motto, the place where dreams come true. Some of you may have been there. They make a lot of money there. There are millions of people that visit at Disney World every year. A dream can change the world. This past week, we remembered the 50th anniversary of the death of a great leader of the last century who stirred the masses, who motivated Americans by a speech where he declared, his most famous speech where he declared, "I have a dream." But as powerful as dreams are, and as motivating as they can be, a dream, when it's lost, a dream that dies, can be devastating. In fact, as powerful as dreams are to motivate us, they can be equally, maybe even more so, devastating to us when we lose them. And the more we've invested in that dream, the more we've hoped for that dream, the more we've imagined it, the more it's been with us, the more difficult it can be for us to lose it. The relationship didn't happen. That person, maybe they married someone else or they left you for someone else. You never had kids, or you were never able to. You never got married. You weren't able to buy that house with a white picket fence or whatever it was that you dreamed of, that house at the lake or at the beach. You didn't get the job. You didn't get the promotion. You didn't get the recognition or the award or the achievement or the championship. That was so close. And what can be especially hard is when that dream was maybe within grasp, or we were close to it, or we were pursuing it, and someone else got in the way. Someone else pursued that relationship, or someone else was at the right place at the right time. We just didn't have the skills or the abilities or the possibility to reach that dream. And what happened is those dreams became a casualty to adversity. What can be hard is that to know that we had a chance at those dreams and maybe they just didn't pan out, or we failed, we had a chance, we missed it, we messed up, but at least we had a shot. But what can be especially hard or devastating or bitter is that we had the chance, but somebody else stepped in the way. Someone else was actively opposing that dream. Someone else was maybe an adversary to that dream becoming a reality. And what happens is that those lost dreams can lead to a lifetime of bitterness. We spend our life thinking about what could have been, what should have been, if they hadn't done this or that. That lost dream can cast a shadow over our entire lives. Well, today I want to tell you about a young man who was known as a dreamer. We're going to journey with this young man from his teenage years into later middle adulthood. He was a young man with dreams, great dreams, grand dreams. But his dreams seem to have been lost. They seem to have been dead, died. Because some people who should have been looking out for him and pursuing what was in his best interest weren't. And not only did they neglect what was their responsibility toward him, they were complicit in his demise. And that young man's name was Joseph. Joseph is a character in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. He was the son of Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham. Jacob was the grandson of Abraham. These are the patriarchal, sort of the founding family of Israel. And Joseph was one of 12 brothers. He had one sister that we know about, the Bible tells us about. Joseph was the youngest for a very long time. He was the youngest and the only son born to Rachel, who was the woman that Jacob fell in love with from the beginning, who he originally wanted to marry, but things conspired, or they transpired in a very weird way. And it turned out that Jacob had married multiple wives. He had Rachel and her sister Leah, and he had all these children. But Joseph was the one born to Rachel. And it took many years for Rachel to have a son. And so Joseph was his father's favorite. And the thing about it is that Jacob didn't even try to hide that Joseph was his favorite. He made it clear. He made a special robe just for Joseph, just to identify him as being especially chosen and loved by his father. And Joseph's other brothers, they loved this. They were all on board. No, they weren't. They hated it. Joseph grew up in a world of privilege. Joseph knew no other way of living except to be the chosen one, the child of privilege. Until a few years later when his brother Benjamin was born. And actually when Benjamin was born, Joseph's mother died in the process of childbirth. But for many years, Joseph was the one. That's the only world that he knew. And then Joseph began to have dreams. He began to have dreams of grandeur, which he already had that, so it was just a continuation of the world in which he was already living. He had dreams of working out in the fields with his brothers, and they were harvesting sheaves of grain, and then suddenly their sheaves all stood up and bowed down to his. Then he had dreams of the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. And Joseph, in being kind of naive, he shared freely about these dreams. He said, listen, brothers, listen to this dream I had. All of your sheaves were bowing down to me. And all of in the 11 stars, guess what? There's 11 brothers bowing down to me. Even Jacob at one point says, listen, what are these dreams that you had? What are you doing, talking about these dreams? Well, we find out that to Joseph's brothers, this is no trivial matter. And one day, while Joseph has been sent by Jacob to check on his brothers, who were apparently up to no good, Joseph's sort of like the annoying hall monitor or the policeman. He's the policeman of the family, the young kid going out there and doing this, goes out there to check on his brothers. And literally, while it says that he is on the way, the brothers see him in the distance. And in Genesis chapter 37, verses 19 and 20, they say, here comes that dreamer. And they say, come now, let us kill him. We see this is a very serious matter, their disdain for their brother. And throw him into one of these cisterns, which is kind of like a pit or maybe a little well in the ground, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. We'll kill him, but we'll tell our father that that something happened to him. Some wild animal killed him. And then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Well, Reuben, who was the oldest, I guess the one that was supposed to be the most responsible, says, hey, listen, okay, let's just throw him in this pit and let's just decide to do what to do with him a little bit later. After all, Reuben kind of wanted to spare his life. He didn't want Joseph to die. But Reuben leaves the scene. He goes away for a time, and he comes back later. He's going to retrieve Joseph while he's kind of safely in this pit. But then the brothers look up, and they see a caravan in the distance. A caravan of Ishmaelites who were nomads, who would have been the ancestors of the Arabs today. And they see this caravan. Then Judah, who is the fourth-born son, who is really becoming the leader of the group, Judah speaks up and says, hey, there's a after all, hey, what are we talking about killing our brother here? After all, he is our flesh and blood. But let's see what we can do. We could profit off of him. We could sell him to these Ishmaelites. We'll make a little money. We'll tell our father that some wild animal got him, and then we won't have the death of our brother on our conscience. And so the plan seems good to the rest, and they sell their brother into slavery. A caravan of Ishmaelites going to Egypt, who carry Joseph to Egypt, and there they sell him to Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And so Joseph becomes a slave in the house of the chief official to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. From a chosen son to a slave. It seems that Joseph's dreams are lost. Now, in Joseph's world, and really in some sense in ours too, when people face adversity like that, when they face challenges like that, a lot of times we tell ourselves, and they certainly told themselves in that day, that they must have done something. I mean, karma's going to get you. What goes around comes around. They must have done something. Here he's gone from being the privileged son, the chosen one, this kind of naive, arrogant, self-centered young brat, to being a slave. After all, I mean, he kind of he's getting what's coming to him. But we're told in Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, we're actually told something very different about Joseph. Joseph is sold into slavery. But we're told that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Far from being rejected by God and being punished by God to be shown a lesson, Joseph is favored by God. God is with him, even though he's a slave. He's made the journey into slavery. So I think we can say this from this part of the story. We can say that adversity or going through hardship, taking a great fall like Joseph has, at least in his status and in his experience, adversity isn't a sign that God hates you. It doesn't mean that God is displeased with you. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've done anything wrong, that you've done something to deserve it, which can be a little scary. Because that means if it could happen to them, it could happen to me. It could happen to us. Well, Joseph is in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar notices that there's something different about Joseph. He notices that Joseph is a man of integrity. He notices that he can trust Joseph, that he can trust him with all the affairs of his household. And it seems like Joseph is doing such a great job of managing his household that he gives him responsibility over the entire house. And it seems like Potiphar's house is prospering because of Joseph. But Potiphar isn't the only one who notices Joseph. Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. And so Potiphar's wife began to try to seduce him. In fact, she says to him, "Come to bed with me," explicitly, repeatedly. To the place at one point, she catches Joseph alone. After all, he's a slave. He's her slave just as much as Potiphar's slave. She's supposed to do what he wants. Or he's supposed to do what she wants. And so she catches him alone, and this time she grabs him, and she says, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph says to her, he says, "My master has given me responsibility over his entire house, everything that belongs to him. But this is different. You are his wife. And literally the words Joseph uses is, how could I commit this sin against God? And when she grabs him, Joseph runs. And she's left holding his clothes. The clothes are still in her hands when Joseph runs away. And then she begins to cry out, humiliated by Joseph, by this slave. She begins to cry out, oh, he's tried to abuse me. He's tried to violate me. Look what this slave has done to me. Now we're told that Potiphar is very angry about this. So he takes Joseph and puts him in prison. The fact that he put Joseph in prison instead of killing him is a sign that maybe he doesn't totally trust his wife. Usually that would have been penalized by death. And probably the prison where Joseph is placed was in Potiphar's house. He was captain of the guard. There weren't that many prisons there. We're told that it was a prison for the king's prisoners. So it was a political prisoners who stayed there. And so Joseph is in this prison. But here we learn something else about the adversity that Joseph experiences, just like the adversity that we experience. And that is that adversity reveals character. Even though Joseph was ultimately punished for doing the right thing. You ever had that to happen? You did the right thing and you got punished for it. It seems like maybe circumstances didn't work out to your advantage because you did the right thing. No good deeds goes unpunished, right? But in spite of that, Joseph doesn't compromise on his principles. And we get a glimpse here at what are the true founding principles in Joseph's life. Adversity reveals character. Now, by this time it seems that surely Joseph's dreams are dead. He's gone from a 17-year-old teenager to now being about 30 years of age. He's in prison for something that he didn't do. But we discover that not only does Joseph have dreams, or that he's had dreams, but he's also able to interpret them. Two political prisoners, those who were in the king's court, the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh, are there in prison with Joseph. And they have dreams. And they're troubled about them. And Joseph sees this and he asks them. And they tell him their dreams. And Joseph gives them an interpretation. And it turns out that Joseph's interpretations are exactly what comes to pass. And Joseph tells the cupbearer, he says, when you get back to the right hand of Pharaoh, because my dream says you're going to be in good graces with Pharaoh again. When you're at his right hand and he's putting his cup into your hand, don't forget about me. Talk to Pharaoh about me. Put in a good word for me because I'm in prison for something I didn't do. But again, the cupbearer is restored and Joseph faces adversity. He forgets about Joseph until one night Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh doesn't just have one dream, he has two dreams. They're both very similar. In one dream, he sees 7 fat cows coming up out of the Nile River, and then there's 7 skinny, gaunt cows that come up out and eat up the 7 fat cows. And then he dreams there's 7 heads of grain that are healthy that come up out of the ground, and then there's 7 scorched and dried up heads of grain that come up and eat up the healthy grains. And he doesn't understand what these dreams mean. And he asks all the wise men of Egypt, and none of them can tell him. And then the cupbearer says, I remember this guy named Joseph who was in prison with me, and he interpreted my dream, and it came to pass. Perhaps he can interpret the king's dream. And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and he tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph says, my Lord the king, God has revealed to you what's going to happen. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. That's the 7 fat cows, the 7 healthy heads of grain. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine, which is the skinny cows or the dried up heads of grain. So, Pharaoh, you better use those 7 years of plenty to store up for the 7 years of famine. And it might be a good idea to put some really smart person in charge of storing up and distributing. And Pharaoh says, that sounds like good advice. You do it. And so Joseph goes from being a slave to being the second most powerful man in Egypt. And the days of plenty come. just as Joseph predicted. They store up grain, and they're ready. Only Egypt is ready when the famine comes. And it turns out that the famine spreads to Canaan, which is the land where Joseph's family lives, where Jacob and his brothers are. And Jacob and his brothers hear, they don't have any food, the famine is spread there, and they hear that there's bread in Egypt. There's grain in Egypt. And so Jacob sends his sons. He sends them to Egypt to get the bread, or get this grain. And so they come to Egypt, and there they are sent, of course, to the man who's in charge of distributing grain. And we're told in Genesis chapter 42, verse 6, in this incredible encounter, Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. And when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces. They didn't recognize him. They bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph's dream was fulfilled. Now, Joseph doesn't reveal himself to his brothers right away. He's a little skeptical, a little skittish about them and their character for good reason. He concocts a plan to get Benjamin, who is his younger brother, to Egypt with him so he can keep him safe, because it's clear that he doesn't trust his brothers. They might do to Benjamin what they did to him. And so he concocts this plan. He sends them back to Canaan. He said, with the instructions, next time you come, you better bring Benjamin. So next time they bring Benjamin, and he has this plan to where he's going to keep Benjamin with him. And he still hasn't told him who he is until Judah, the leader, steps up and says, listen, it's going to kill our father if we come back without Benjamin. Keep me in Benjamin's place. And then Joseph recognizes that his brothers have changed, and he reveals himself to his brothers, and they are reunited. And of course, his brothers are freaked out beyond belief. Jacob comes, he's revived, his son is alive and not dead. He comes, and all the family comes to live in Egypt under the care of Joseph, until Jacob dies. And after the old man dies, the brothers are afraid again. Because now that Jacob's gone, who knows what Joseph is going to do to us? I mean, we're talking decades of his life that he was a slave and in prison because of us. And we're told in Genesis chapter 50, beginning of verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to each other, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? I mean, what we did to him was terrible. And so they sent word to him. They got an idea. They've got a plan. They're on top of this. Say, your father left these instructions before he died. You know, your father, our father, this is what he said. He says, this is what you are to say to Joseph. You know, just to make sure you're getting the message, this is what we're saying. Whether he really said this or not, we don't know. But this is this is the message from Jacob. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. They're calling themselves servants. Forgive us. Dad said, be nice to your brothers. Forgive them, because really, they are at his mercy. And we're told that when their message came to him, Joseph wept. Now, sometimes, I've discovered this as a parent of a toddler, sometimes when you can cry because you're really mad. Okay? You can. Some people get so angry. We get so angry, there's tears of anger, and we've been victimized and wronged. But Joseph's tears here, what I see is not the tears of bitterness. That all of those years of hardship and those years of adversity, instead of making Joseph harder, they've softened his heart. His heart softened. And we see Joseph's heart toward his brother. He says his brothers came and threw themselves down before him, and they said, we are your slaves. And I want you to look at what Joseph says. This is incredible. This is incredible. Joseph said to them, Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Now that is key, because here we see where Joseph's big picture, where his worldview comes into play, and where it comes from. You intended to harm me. You did. There's no other way around it. Said, oh, don't worry about it, You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. What you intended for harm, God intended for good. You see, it's Joseph's belief in God and his belief that God reigns over all, that even in remembering all that's happened to him and all that's been done to him over years spent as a slave, false accusations, in prison, alienated from his family for over 20 years, not seeing his brothers, particularly his younger brother Benjamin. Now Joseph is married, he has children in Egypt. All of this, Joseph is able to see his adversity in the bigger picture of God's plan. Because in truth, if that hadn't have happened, if those wrongs hadn't have been done, they might have all died. They wouldn't have been prepared, and not just them, but everyone, the whole world. But they were ready because God had guided Joseph this whole time. God was in charge after all. See, I think we see here the key for how we can handle adverse circumstances and adverse treatment from other people, from the example of Joseph. You see that serenity in adversity, being able to have that sense of peace about what happens and what has happened to us. Serenity in adversity comes from certainty of a divine destiny. That I believe that God is in control, that God is ultimately in charge here, and God is working all things toward a good purpose. God can turn and will turn my adversity into prosperity. That's the only way one can approach this adversity with a sense of serenity in believing in the sovereignty of God. Our theme verse for this series is Romans chapter 4, verse 17, where Paul is using Abraham as an example and how he was a believer in God in spite of seemingly an impossible promise that God made to Abraham. And this is the way he describes God. The God that we believe in is a God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Things that we couldn't imagine, that we couldn't see, that we couldn't dream up. This is what our God is doing. He's taking circumstances and He's working them for good. He's working evil for good in ways that we couldn't imagine. He's even bringing life from the dead. The God of the comeback. You see, ultimately what matters isn't what happens to us, it's how we respond to it and what we believe about it. What we believe about what happens to us, and specifically what we believe about God. Because what you believe will determine how you respond to adversity. What you believe. You can say what you believe, all that you want, but I can get a glimpse at what you believe, what you really believe, by how you respond to adversity when things are not going well. Now, when you say that, hey, it's easy for Joseph to say God was working all this time when he's on the throne in Egypt. I mean, he's been completely restored. He can see that what happened wound up saving the lives of his family and the whole world. But what about me? What about in my circumstance? How can I have this same confidence? Well, it's possible because of someone else. And this one was a favorite of his father. The favorite son, the chosen son of his father. He had a vision of being exalted or worshiped by all of Israel. And that vision sparked jealousy among his brethren. This one was sold for pieces of silver, just as Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver, about 8 ounces of silver. This one was sold for pieces of silver by one named Judas, which is the Greek version of the name Judah. Just like Jesus, or just like Joseph, Jesus found refuge in Egypt. He faced adversity after adversity, but he prospered in the midst of that adversity. Just like Joseph, he was thrown into a pit. And just like Joseph, he came out of that pit. And just like Joseph, he's the only one with bread that truly satisfies, and the whole world will die apart from the bread of life offered by Jesus. You see, my friends, you can have confidence in your adversity. You can have assurance of a comeback because Jesus came back. Because Jesus came back from the dead. Because God worked good from the worst evil that had ever been committed on the face of the earth. You can have confidence that God will bring good from your evil. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Either Jesus is alive or he's still dead. If he's alive, this means God is in control, that God has the victory, that ultimately God is reigning over all and is working every evil for good. So, maybe today you're still in the dungeon. You're still in Potiphar's house. You're still in the pit. But the question is, in the midst of your adversity, you can't see the throne room. You can't see how it's all going to work out. You can't see how good's going to come of all of this. The question is, are you going to dwell on the setback, on that obstacle, on that problem, on that adversity? Or are you going to believe in the God of Easter Sunday, the God of resurrection, the God who brings life from the dead, the God who's working all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose, the God of the comeback? You see, ultimately what matters is that empty tomb, a risen Savior. The risen Savior, the empty tomb is the game changer. And because the tomb was empty, my friends, your comeback is coming. Every setback is an opportunity to discover the God of the comeback.